So now let's take a look at homework exercise 7 and review these arguments related to the category of interpretation, the being category of interpretation. As the instructions indicate, identify the specific type or form of argument related to being in each of the following examples. And in this case, your choices are given in a multiple choice form. And so you need to read each of the arguments and determine which of the choices best describes the form or type of argument from the category of being that is evident in the example. So number 1, we cannot permit the government unlimited access to electronic communication. While national security is indeed important, the invasion of privacy and the dangers to liberty such access entails far outweigh any national security rationale. So we do have an argument, obviously, and the first statement is the claim: we cannot permit government unlimited access to electronic communication, which means the evidence statement is the second one here. And we notice in the evidence statement that we have the contrast or comparison of two different perspectives. We have the national security perspective, and we also have the concerns related to privacy and the dangers to liberty. And when we read that whole statement, we see that the preference is given to the concerns about privacy and dangers to liberty. And so that perspective is privileged over the national security perspective. And then it's on that basis that is the more important element of invasion of privacy and danger to liberty that we draw the conclusion we cannot permit government unlimited access to electronic communication. And when we have an argument where the evidence is a comparison or contrast of various perspectives, where one is given preference or is privileged, we call that the dissociation argument, right? So answer D is the correct answer here, dissociation argument. Number 2, the trustees are in danger of destroying the academic reputation of the university as professors leave for better opportunities elsewhere. Take, for instance, Professor Westphal in philosophy. His recent Facebook post says he's leaving UNH primarily to break free of the destructive policies and attitudes of the trustees. So in this case, there's actually several statements, but it seems clear that the first statement is the claim: the trustees are in danger of destroying the academic reputation of the university as professors leave for better opportunities elsewhere. And the evidence here is the particular case of Professor Westphal in philosophy. And then there's further evidence that his case is appropriate to this claim because it says that he's leaving because of the trustees. So there is kind of a generalization argument here. We have a general claim: the trustees are in danger of destroying the academic reputation of the university as professors leave for better opportunities. And then the evidence is given. It's not a survey, as we might typically find with all the formal properties of an opinion survey. But in this case, it's a generalization based on a particular instance. And so we would refer to that as a variation of the generalization argument. It's an argument by example. Okay? And the particular example here, Professor Westphal, is the evidence for the claim that professors are leaving, and so the trustees are endangering the reputation of the university. Number 3, all of the players who arrived at the park on time heard the report of the scouting team. It follows that none of them will be fined by the management. As you read these two statements, you also probably notice this argument indicator. It follows that, and that tells us that the second statement here is the claim. None of them will be fined by the management. But the evidence here, if we read carefully the evidence statement, how do we know that none of them will be fined? Well, the players who arrived at the park on time heard the report of the scouting team. So we have in that first evidence statement, subject term and a predicate term. Subject term is players who arrived at the park on time. The predicate term, players who heard the report of the scouting team. And then the conclusion is, it follows that none of them, who's the them? It's the players who arrived at the park on time, the same subject term, but now it's combined with a different predicate term, players fined by the management. And so in this case, you probably recognize we have reasoning by considering relationships between classes or categories of people represented by the different subject and predicate terms. This is, in effect, a quasi-logical argument. That is, it's imitating the form of a syllogism, and we reason that none of the players will be fined by the management because we also know that the players who arrived at the park on time were also in the category of the players who heard the report of the scouting team. This is what we call then, because it's a quasi-logical imitation of a syllogism, it's what we call the transitivity argument. Number 4, the Munchkins should be considered citizens of Oz because their village falls within the administrative district of the Emerald City. So in this case, I think you could read this in a couple of different ways, but I take this to be an argument from definition. That is, how do we define, in effect, a citizen of Oz? To be a citizen of Oz, the sort of authoritative or legal or statute definition would be any person who falls within the administrative district of the Emerald City. And the Munchkins, being in that group, also then would be considered citizens of Oz. But even in the way that I just described that, you also might see that it has elements of a transitivity argument as well, because we're thinking about the categories. We're thinking about people who are citizens of Oz, people who are in Munchkin Village, and people who are in the administrative district of Emerald City, and thinking about those categories. And I think maybe the better answer here is argument from definition, because we seem to be invoking or referencing a particular administrative or statute or legal definition of what counts as a citizen of Oz. So let's take a look at number 5. Well, of course, the university saves money in the short term by cutting faculty positions and courses. In the long run, however, the quality of education will suffer, and that will hurt enrollment and make the budget problems worse. So in this instance, again, the claim is the budget problems are going to be worse in the long run, right? But notice here when we compare short-term and long-term, or short-term and long run, right? We're thinking about different perspectives from which to consider the action of cutting faculty positions and courses. And sure, it saves money in the short term, and some people like to make decisions based on short-term calculations. But in this instance, the arguer says the long-term perspective is the more important perspective. In the long run, the quality of education will suffer. That will hurt enrollment and make the budget problems worse. So in this case, we have another instance of dissociation argument because of the construction of the reasoning by a contrast or comparison of perspectives. The perspectives here being the long-term perspective, which is the privileged one or preferred one, versus the short-term perspective. Number 6, the law defines adequate education as instruction that enables students to participate in contemporary economic and civic life. It is clear that since the school district offers neither computer education nor an approved civics curriculum, that they do not meet the standards set by the law. So in this case, there's a really good clue. The law defines, right? And it tells us what we're defining, what the term is, adequate education, and it gives us that authoritative definition which comes from the law. And then we look closely since, which is the argument indicator telling us this is the evidence, and the evidence is that this school district does not provide a civics curriculum or computer education, so it does not meet the definition. This is an argument from definition, because we have an authoritative, that is a legal definition of adequate education, and we're making the argument that this particular school district does not meet that because it fails to have computer education and an improved civics curriculum. Number 7. In a recent study, the UNH Survey Center, having polled 450 citizens from all around the state of New Hampshire, determined that nearly 300 of those polled were born outside of the state of New Hampshire. This surprising result means that only 1/3 of current residents were native-born citizens of the Granite State. Now, what you might recognize here is, as with a survey or polling, right, a generalization argument. So if we think about the parts of this argument, the generalization claim here is that 1/3 of the current residents were native-born citizens of the Granite State. But obviously the survey didn't poll every one of the 1.5 million citizens of the Granite State. It polled only 450. And of the 450, determined 300 were born outside the state. So the sample is the 450 citizens that answered the survey. The projected property was the 2/3 of the citizens found to have been born outside the state of New Hampshire. And that projected property is now projected to be true, or likely or probably to be true, of all the citizens of the state, because the target population is the full population of the state of New Hampshire. So we move from the poll of 450 citizens, assuming it's a representative sample, to the claim 1/3 of the current residents, only 1/3 of the current residents were native-born citizens of the Granite State. So this is a clear example of a generalization argument. So let's look at number 8. To be sold as Irish whiskey, a product must be triple distilled within either Ireland or Northern Ireland, made from grains natural to the Irish countryside, and be aged for at least 12 years. This product, although old enough and made from natural Irish grain, is nevertheless distilled and shipped from Edinburgh, Scotland. It is not then Irish whiskey. So in this instance, we're trying to figure out, again, these are all being category arguments, trying to figure out what something is. And in this case, we do that by dividing up the qualities or characteristics of Irish whiskey, considering each of them separately as criteria, and determining that this particular product, which we're trying to determine, right, this particular product has some of the criteria, but not all of them. And so we can conclude it is not then Irish whiskey on the basis of an argument by division, right? Because we've considered all of the criteria or all of the elements, characteristics, or qualities that must be possessed by a true Irish whiskey, and found that this particular product we're considering lacks one of them, so it does not qualify to be considered as Irish whiskey. But we've arrived at that by dividing Irish whiskey into its component parts or elements and considering each of them separately. The argument by division. Number 9. I know a balanced budget will bring us emotional satisfaction and political credit, but from an economic point of view, it makes no sense. We should not pass the balanced budget amendment. So in this case, pretty simple argument. We have a clear claim here. We should not pass the balanced budget amendment. The should tells us this is a policy claim, right? But then we also looked at the evidence statement, considers the proposal for a balanced budget amendment. It considers that proposal from several different points of view, as the language says here, or perspectives. We have the emotional and political perspectives considered, but also the economic point of view. And it's the economic point of view that is given preference here. And so the preference given to the economic point of view leads us to the conclusion that we shouldn't pass the balanced budget amendment. It's that privileged perspective of economics that tells us this is another instance of dissociation argument. We should not allow unregulated development of cloning technology. While the potential medical and scientific benefits are intriguing, the moral and ethical questions involved in tampering with natural genetic evolution and reproduction are more compelling. And having just done one, you may recognize this also is a dissociation argument, because we arrive at the conclusion that we should not allow unregulated development of cloning technology by considering that proposal or that activity from different perspectives. We have the medical and scientific perspectives, and sure, there are benefits that may be associated with that, but we also have the moral and ethical perspective, and that is what is privileged here. So the preference being given to the moral and ethical questions lead us to the conclusion that we shouldn't allow unregulated development of cloning technology, because those perspectives are more compelling, right? So the comparison of perspectives gives the preference to the moral and ethical. So another instance of dissociation argument. Number 11. The case of the murder of Officer Briggs by Michael Addison proves the need for a death penalty in this state. How many more cases like this do you need before you see the solution? So in this instance, we have a general claim, right, that we need a death penalty in the state, and the evidence that's given, particular case, how many more cases, asks the reasoner, right? But we have the particular case, the case of, right? And so the generalization is based on this particular case, another example of argument by example. Number 12, all of the students who came to class before Thanksgiving got the extra practice quiz. It follows that none of them will fail the test on Monday. So here again, we think about this and the structure. We have the it follows that, right, which is the argument indicator telling us the conclusion is none of them, that is students who came to class before Thanksgiving, that none of those students will fail the test on Monday. Why? Because they also got the extra practice quiz. So again, we have categories indicated by or represented by the subject and predicate terms. We have students who came to class before Thanksgiving, students who got the extra practice quiz, and students who will not fail the test on Monday. So we reason to that conclusion or that claim on the basis of knowing which categories those students were also in the evidence statement, right? So if you came to class before Thanksgiving, then you're also in the category or class of people who got the extra practice quiz. Presumably then it follows, right, that none of them will fail the test on Monday. Why? Because those students also got the extra practice quiz. Or we could say students who got the extra practice quiz are students who don't fail the test on Monday. That kind of quasi-logical reasoning we call a transitivity argument. Number 13. Since students using the latest version of Safari are unable to download the distance learning lectures, it seems likely that there is a technological incompatibility between the Kaltura lecture program and the Mac browser. Okay, so in this case, we have a problem, an issue that we're trying to explain. We have it's all one sentence, but we have two statements, and we have it seems likely that, right? This tells us here comes a conclusion or a claim based on the evidence. Since tells us here's the evidence. Students using the latest version of Safari are unable to download the distance learning lectures. So that's the evidence, and we have a claim, it seems likely, and we would call that then a hypothesis argument. We're offering a hypothesis to explain the puzzling facts. The puzzling facts here, students can't download the lectures. And so we would apply tests for a hypothesis argument. Is this a simple, does it account for all the facts in the case? Is it a simple explanation? And is it a frequent explanation? And it seems if you apply that kind of critical thinking that it would pass those tests. So it's probably a reasonable hypothesis. It may not be correct, we might be mistaken, but it seems like a reasonable explanation. So we call that a hypothesis argument. Number 14. An eligible scholarship recipient must meet certain criteria. He or she must be ranked in the top 10% of his or her graduating class, must score at least 700 on the verbal portion of the SAT, must have studied Latin for 4 years in high school, and must be accepted to the Medieval Studies program. If you look at the file, you will see that Anselm was ranked third in his class, scored 760 on his SAT verbal test, has studied Latin since junior high, and is enrolled in Medieval Studies. He meets all the criteria and is therefore eligible. So this may seem like an obvious example of argument by division, but we'll review it briefly. We have the criteria for scholarship recipient, and criteria is usually a pretty good clue that we may have an argument by division. And indeed, as we go through, we see all of those criteria or standards are identified separately. That is, the qualities related to being a scholarship recipient are identified separately, and we're considered one by one, that is the argument by division, one by one in the particular case. So we find that Anselm indeed meets all those criteria. He's ranked third in his class, 760 on the SAT, studied Latin since junior high, enrolled in Medieval Studies. All of those boxes are checked. That's the reasoning or argument by division. And then finally, number 15, United Nations peace missions inevitably end in failure. Take as a case in point the UN mission in Lebanon in the 1980s. Okay. So we have two statements. The first one seems to be the claim United Nations missions inevitably end in failure. That's a kind of a general claim about all United Nations peace missions. The evidence that's given is the one case of the UN mission in Lebanon in the 1980s. This take as a case in point is a good clue that this is another argument by example. That is, the claim rests on the evidence of a particular case or example, in this case, the instance of the UN mission in Lebanon in the 1980s. So that's a review of the 15 examples related to the category of interpretation for being arguments. If you have questions on any of these items or on any of the forms of argument reviewed, post them to the discussion board.